Well, welcome to episode 4 of our podcast, C.A.R.s, Coffee and Christ, here in season 3. This is our podcast for Automotive, Royale, our company here in Mounds, Oklahoma, right outside the Tulsa Metroplex area. As always, I'm your host, Ross Turner, and serve as the corporate chaplain here at C.A.R. And we're doing a number of concurrent series kind of within our season in season 3. One of them we've been doing on faith at work. The second one that we're going to continue today is on our company values and kind of core ethics about how we want to be as people and how we want to work together as members of our company. Last time we discussed having a growth mindset, which I think was a very helpful discussion for us. Today we're going to build on that. We're going to talk about resolving conflict, which is something that a lot of people are challenged by and don't do very well, but yet the Bible does have a lot to say about how to do this right. So I thought we'd start today by just asking an opening question about what you think about conflict and how does it strike you? How do you typically respond to conflict? And no fake answers, okay? Like, just give the real answer here, okay? There's no judgment of like, what's your typical MO when you know there's a conflict or there is conflict coming? How do you typically respond or not respond? What would you all say?
I am very conflict avoidant.
Yeah.
Conflict makes my insides not feel good at all, and I cringe, and then I just ruminate before actually confronting somebody. It does not feel good inside at all. I have to sit there and think through everything that I'm going to say. Yeah. Think of the different scenarios of how is this going to come out? Is it worth even mentioning? Is it worth it to me? Is it worth it to the situation? Yeah. Everything, all that is building up inside of me. I don't like it at all. But it's unavoidable sometimes.
Yeah. Growing up, I was super conflict avoidant. Like, same exact, like Abby is saying, like, way overthink it, way make it bigger in my head than it was. And I think it was because my family growing up was kind of like, hey, everything's great. Like, it was very uplifting family, but it creates a tremendous amount of conflict avoidance. Yeah. Right? And so it wasn't until I entered, leadership, really, at my current company that I was forced into it, and actually the Lord was guiding me into conflict, and I did not like it at first, but I began to value not conflict for conflict's sake, but resolution, right? Because it festers, it's like a wound you don't treat, and then it starts to get infected, and it starts hurting both people, and it's under the skin, and it's terrible. And so if you address it right away, it like quickly is. It's almost like immediately putting a bandage on a wound to let it heal. And it although hard, alcohol hits a wound and you're just like, there's pain there, but you got to get it done, right? Yeah. It's like a necessary part of community. It's a necessary part of business. It's good communication. And so but my first intention, like inside, I think I still have it, but I'm like, I've learned to just walk right into it and ignore all the pain, so it's like you have a natural tendency and then you have a learned behavior, right? And the learned behavior is kind of like overtaking the natural tendency.
Yeah. So a little bit of kind of conflict avoidance growing up, but having through your own environments and work, having to just basically learn how to walk into it. Josh, that's great. JJ, what about you? What's your MO when it comes to conflict as conflict arises?
Well, as a young adolescent, I didn't mind it all, actually. Yeah. Liked it. Mm-hmm. But now, I don't like those knockdown drag-outs, Yeah. I like peace. So kind of, I try to not make it bigger than it is. Yeah. Which ends up being, like you guys are talking about, just, I withdraw and then overthink it. And, like you were saying, is even worth bringing up, is even worth talking about. So then it just gets kind of brushing under the rug, and somebody trips over it, and there's a big kaboom.
Yeah. That's great, JJ. Yeah, for me, my family had no problem having conflict. So, growing up, it was kind of like part of our life. And we didn't always like fight and stuff, but just we dealt with it for better or for worse, like just often. Parents would get upset, kids would get upset at each other. We would just say, hey, we're gonna resolve this, whatever, and dad has the final authority here, kind of thing. But we never we never pretended things were fine in our family. Most of the time, I'd say it was a little bit of a free for all. I would say in my family growing up. So I kind of grew up being comfortable with conflict, though having to figure out how to do it in a way that wasn't so abrupt. I think it not always came across maybe gentle or actually dealing with the problem maybe underneath. It kind of dealt with the symptoms of things. So for me, it was more of like trying to think through, is this a conflict worth having? Is this something to actually talk about? Kind of taking some steps back from that method, though it wasn't always like a fight with parents and stuff. It was dealt with quickly, I think, most of the time. At least the surface level stuff was. So I think most people struggle with conflict a lot, and I think we all do in our different ways. We all kind of gave some different approaches to that, but maybe we can kind of go through kind of briefly about each one of those, about why they might not be as helpful, right? So I think the first one maybe we can talk about is, why is conflict avoidance not the healthiest way to try to deal with and resolve conflict? Why is conflict avoidance not going to help? And now I'm talking about actual things that need to be resolved. You know what I mean? Not something that's like, we can kind of let that go, right? What about things that we need to resolve? Why is conflict avoidance not really a healthy solution? What do you all think?
It ends up like a cancer, It just kind of makes the whole, scenario of sickness, and it grows, and just is bad for the wound.
It kind of continues to let it grow and fester, and we kind of just allow it by doing that. That's right. Anyone else?
Yeah, there's that phrase, like, unforgiveness is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die, and it's a self poison that grows and starts affecting your heart towards, like, in the environment. Like, you could have a great job, but then like one conflict can completely poison what was peace and what was enjoyment or fulfillment, just because it could be one relationship. It could be, it's just like not addressing that thing. And also, when the actual conflict arises, it's boiled up. So it could have been something that could have just been an uncomfortable conversation. You had it and you moved on. Or over months, it moves into an emotional blow up, where all of those thoughts from the moment that it occurred added up in your mind to the moment that everything has to be said that you've been going through over the last 2 months, and it just overflows. And so it's like this, I call it kind of like a boiling pot. It's like you need a pressure relief valve, and that's communication. And without that pressure relief valve, man, it explodes.
Yeah. I mean, basically, it's happening whether you like it or not, is kind of what we're saying. And it might lead to, an overwhelming kind of overflow, outburst, whatever, or it might just lead to a cancer that kills somebody, right? But it's happening whether we like it or not, and we really can't avoid it. Maybe for a time, yes, but ultimately, no, right? So it doesn't really deal with the problem long term, though it might feel better at the moment not to have to deal with it, or to kind of be oblivious to it, is one way, right? What about seeking out the conflict, right? Or kind of being conflict oriented as a person, right? Where, say, hey, I just deal with things, right? Kind of, I'm just going to go after things. Why does that mentality maybe lead us astray, or maybe not deliver the way we want?
The scripture says, be slow to speak, right? And I think that's kind of what Abigail and JJ were saying earlier, which was essentially like thinking about all of the scenarios is wisdom in a way. Because it's empathy. Because some things don't need to be said. Otherwise, you can just be, that comes out in like the complainer. There's people that just complain and they add nothing. I consider those like people that break down There are ones that are, we call our kids, we say we're builders, not breakers. You know, some words build up and some words break down. And in the kingdom, you're meant to build. You're not meant to break down and tear down. That's the wrong kingdom. So you become this kind of like squeaky wheel or complainer. In, you know, Song of Solomon, it's the dripping faucet, or the you know, the rain on the roof. You know, like all those scenarios where someone's just constantly, you know, picking at everything, right? And you become an irritant to everyone around you, and you're only tearing away, and you're never building up, right? And so I think it's good to give thought to your words so that you can be loving. Right, because some things aren't needed to be said. Some things are just like, get over it and move on, because it doesn't need to be communicated, right? And that's where the wisdom is when things need to be communicated, because it's for the better good of you and everyone around you, you know, and the other person. Yeah. Or is it something that you just kind of need to build a bridge and get over it? You know, like, you know, be a builder.
It's great, Josh. Anyone else? Why is seeking out what looks like up front, like someone who wants to deal with things, it seems like a good method, right, to kind of correct the avoidance issue, right? But why is there a lack of wisdom there often? What do you all? Anyone else want to jump in with that?
I actually used to think that was an asset to me when I used to do it. I used to be like, well, I just want to get things up front and you know, on the table and deal with them. But like, the more that I see that on other people, the more I see that it's a control thing. Yeah. That it's I can't handle the fact that there's something out there that I can't make go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's great, JJ. Yeah, it is a little bit of a control issue. It's more controlling what other people think or how they respond to you than necessarily actually dealing with conflict. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Otherwise, you could then kind of see the differences of what's needed to have a conflict over or not, right? But if you are trying to control everything can become a conflict. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah, I think it's definitely up front, it looks like a good plan, but it lacks prudence on how it decides on what's worth conflict over, or what's really merits, I think, a conflict about. And then, it, like you said, Josh, it can just become a way that someone just is always like grinding against somebody, or has no sense of appreciation for other people often, or different views, and then it just becomes a conflict-oriented person. You know, then it's like someone who is a contentious person instead of someone who learns to contend for the right things, right? You know, it says in Jude 3, it says to contend for the faith. I think some people have misinterpreted that to just be contentious people, right? They're just fighting about everything. And that's not what that means. So the same thing's true, like conflict is like, there are things to have conflict about. But if you're just having conflict all the time, you're just an oriented person toward that. So that's not the same thing.
I think a good way to see this is marriage. So like you can see marriages where one of the individuals is constantly complaining and constantly conflicting on the other. And I see one of two things happens. They wear down into complacency where they just are resigned. Yeah. I give up. Like, I can't ever make you happy. And so they just kind of fall into this defeated spirit, or it just divides the family, and then this poison comes between the two, the husband and wife, because of one of the individuals being more contentious over time, and you can just see the irritation between them. So there's just irritation where love should be, right? Because of the constant friction, right? If like your skin is a great example of that. If I constantly have friction, I will have a rash and I'll have an irritant, and that irritant will now exist where it was meant to be smooth and it meant to be a enjoyable relationship between the two. And so the two are not in touch with one another because they're just irritated in being around each other. You know, this is where you result in, you know, we're roommates because it's just better we just live in the same house and avoid each other and stay together for the kids. And like, that's a great example, but you take that to like any other relationship. You can do that at work where like you barely talk to other people because of the irritation, or it could be that, you know, like you're just kind of surviving in a spot that you're in a congregation because you can't feel like anything you do is right, you know, and you start to listen to the enemy and it defeats that person. That's just why it's not love. Over time, it doesn't generate the results that are of love and of fulfillment and of, it says build each other up, in the New Testament, not, tear each other down.
Not tear each other down.
Yeah, tear each other down till you finally get to heaven, and then you'll be just right. That's not anywhere in there, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, I think too, you have to think about what is your motivation and what is the end result that you're seeking, right? If you are seeking out conflict, what is the true motivation behind that? Is it just so that you are getting your way? Is it just so that you can be heard? Is it like, are these selfish reasons, or like you said, JJ, like control? I want to control the situation. So if I'm mentioning it first, right, I have the ability to do that. Is it that that person that does nag? Like, why are you always bringing these up? Is it for selfish reasons because, that just irritates you, versus is this something like that taking that pause and thinking, okay, let me use wisdom on, is this something worth bringing up, or am I just getting bothered by it? And I need to think about myself here and think, do I really need to get bothered about this? No. Why is it bothering me so much? And is it the other person, or is that something that I need to have a little introspection here and think, oh, maybe this is something that I need to figure out in myself on why it's bothering me before I go to this other person? Or is it, no, this is a real situation that needs to be addressed for the greater good, not just for my comfort?
Yeah. I think it's the challenge of trying to assess preferences over what's a principle and of morality or some kind of value system that everyone's supposed to share. They say, hey, this is something we're all supposed to share, and there's an actual problem here, right? Or it's just my preference, and I'm just irritated by everybody about it. And it's kind of like, if that becomes the case, everything irritates you to some level, and you have to learn to let those things go. And like JJ was mentioning, like the idea of control. You see this often in not just work environments. At least in work environments, there's a little bit more of a hierarchy set place of who's really in charge. Well, in a church environment, not as much. Kind of, but no. And everyone kind of thinks they're in charge, to be honest. And what happens there is everyone has different ideals about what these groups are supposed to be about. And then everyone has a romantic notion about what they're supposed to live up to. And then everyone just kind of judges each other, has conflict with each other because no one's living up to any of those things. And it creates all sorts of chaos in that, because it's really preferences leading these things instead of this value system that everyone's supposed to share. And so it takes a lot of wisdom to figure out that and to not be conflict-oriented people. But then there's on the other side, there's a different kind of conflict that happens called being a passive-aggressive person, right? And this is like the third element of like, I know I shouldn't have head-on conflict, but I'm going to have it anyway, just a different way, right? So why is being passive-aggressive about situations, really making things just worse? So why is being passive-aggressive fail kind of wholesale to really resolve conflict?
Well, I think it leaves so much unsaid, so that the person that's on the receiving end of the passive-aggressiveness, they're left not knowing exactly what the issue is. If you avoided it, if you're avoiding it, the people may not even know that there's an issue. If you hit it straight on, then they definitely know what your issue is. But if you're passive aggressive, then how are they to know what exactly is going on? And I think too, you may see this in girls and guys differently too. I think if you look at kids, right, you see boys, they'll just wrestle it out, right? One of them gets mad at the other, they'll kick or punch them or whatever. Like, it is very obvious if you upset them. But then you see girls on the playground, and all of a sudden it's, oh, these girls aren't playing with me anymore. Yeah. Why? I don't know. Mm-hmm. There's this unknown that I feel like you may see passive aggressiveness more in girls because that's, for some reason, it is started at a young age. And it's this unknown of, I used to have this friend group and I don't have this friend group anymore. And, oh, what is this? Versus the boys that are just like, whatever, you made me mad.
Yeah. Yeah, there does seem to be more of a tendency, especially if there's more of an unspoken code, I think, with certain people, and they're never up front. Mm-hmm. And if they're never really up front about who they are or what they're about, the passive aggressiveness seems to be kind of the MO a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think, at the root of, I think, passive aggressiveness is manipulation. Mm. It's like, I don't want to have to address this, so I'm going to manipulate the situation so that I hopefully get the outcome or make the other person feel pain I'm feeling. Mm. And that is so the kingdom of darkness. Like, it's definitely not of God. There's no things where he manipulates us in any way. Yeah. So you have to kind of like say, hey, where am I like landing in one, just as a believer, like, but if you're in the world, it also just doesn't resolve anything. Yeah. It doesn't care for people well. No. It doesn't, it's like unfruitful. Yeah. Right, and such is most of the kingdom of darkness. It's just like very unfruitful. You're not going to get the result you want. You're not going to, things aren't going to move back to peace. You're just going to continue to manipulate the situation. Mm-hmm. And so I say, in my mind, I kind of think in results, and it's like, it's a pretty worthless way to go about something. It's just not helpful in any way.
Yeah, I think getting from the practical standpoint is it doesn't really resolve it ever. And then just from an emotional standpoint, it's creating some level of manipulation on the receiving end. I like what you said, Abby. There's this kind of unclarity probably still with it to some level. And at the same time, it's kind of like it's not really achieving any kind of peace really ever. It's creating probably more friction. It might just be creating more confusion as well, because people aren't connected, whether it's their fault or not. Maybe some people should know things, but the reality is it's not resolving anything. And so we're kind of using a different tactic in that way that's even worse, right? It's an irritant, but it's kind of from the backside, in a way. So I've really appreciated several books by a well-known Christian author named Ken Sande, who wrote a series of books on peacemaking. And his famous book goes into the Bible about what it looks like to be a peacemaker. And several other books I recommend, Resolving Everyday Conflict, Peacemaking in Families, very, very good books to really take up and read these. But a principle he kind of hits on is learning the difference between peace faking and peacemaking. He puts a real clear key on that in his books. And I just thought that those are great terms to think through, right? So what does peace faking look like, right? What do you all think? What does faking peace kind of typically look like in our habits, our behaviors, and why does it fail? What do you all think?
I think you're essentially pretending. You're kind of two-facing a situation. So you're going out, other terms with like True North, like I'm wearing, they would call it posing. You're essentially faking a reality that doesn't really exist to save face because maybe you're afraid of what people will think of you. You're afraid of what your boss will think of you, or whether it's like a colleague or your family. Yeah. And you start to, what it does in your life is it starts to create a duality. Yeah. You've got the reality of the situation, which is how you feel, what you say behind closed doors, what you say to other people, where the gossip spreads. But it comes out because over the flow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So it's going to come somewhere. And in these two spaces, even if it's just to yourself and, complaining about them under your breath and cursing them under your breath, it is coming out. Mm-hmm. And essentially, in the amount of, like peace faking you're doing essentially means like, how many split lives are you living? This is definitely what happens with people that are like, in affairs or living a double life or doing something they're not supposed to. If you've got like an addiction, gambling habit, things like that, it creates these dualities. Like literally you're splitting yourself into multiple people and you have to cover the lies on the lies. It's just a terrible place. I've lived there for a while. Like it is a terrible place to be. You can't be authentic.
Yeah.
You know, you at the best you is authentically you with a clear conscience connected to God. Yeah. And unless you are doing that, you can't find peace in that. You're just surviving through the lies that you're putting up on every front. And it's just a terrible way to exist, you know, overall.
Yeah. So peace faking is one you're having to put up a front. Probably dependent upon who it is, but probably in some sense over everything. Yeah, absolutely. Abby, do you want to share something?
Yeah, I would say it goes along the lines of, like you mentioned, JJ, about bottling things up or brushing things under the rug. It's still there. Yeah. You're just pretending that it's not, and then when it comes to head, what ends up happening is, you've been faking it this whole time. You've been bottling it up. But it's still there. You're still keeping that laundry list inside your head. And then when it finally explodes against that individual, you're like listing everything off, bringing things up from 5 years ago that you never forgave, that you've been acting like it's okay, or you've never brought up. And then the other person is like blindsided because they're like, okay, well, how was I supposed to know that you had an issue with that because you never brought it up? Yeah. But it's obviously been bothering you or else you wouldn't have brought it up now. So the other person thinks that everything's been fine, or maybe they sense that something's off, but they don't know exactly what it is, but you've been faking it this whole time. You know, it's like all your whole circle of friends may know your issues against your spouse, but your spouse doesn't know, right? They may think that it's totally fine because you've never addressed it and you've never brought it up. So how are they supposed to know that there's an issue or even try to make the relationship better because they think that it's okay from how you are acting?
Yeah, it seems to be with peace faking, in my experience, is you're saying there's peace when there is no peace. It's kind of like what Jeremiah and Ezekiel say. Like, you're kind of declaring peace over something. You're saying you forgive something. You're kind of going through the motions of something, but you're really not doing it. And it creates this false persona. It creates a false relationship. And it really just kind of covers a bunch of stuff that doesn't really cover it. It doesn't really deal with it. So I think it's kind of not dealing with something, but also calling something dealt with at the same time. And it's really a danger in many ways. And like Josh was saying, there's this kind of facade that's put up. You know, how long can you really wear a mask? I mean, in the end, like it's going to come off at some point, right? Like you can't keep it up. No one can keep it up. So I think there's a sense of it's just not going to work out that way, even though you think it will. And think just saying, hey, everything's fine. It's kind of how people forgive but don't forgive, you know, and they don't know the difference of real forgiveness. They struggle with what that means if they do forgive. It's hard to connect those things for them. And I think that's why this is really more, peacemaking is more of a process than a couple words.
And you can't fake it till you make it.
That's right. You cannot do that. It will not work. And we all tell ourselves that lie, that I can just keep doing this and I can kind of keep like making this work, but like the reality is you're just faking it and you've got to deal with it. But again, the danger is dealing with it in a way that's ungodly, avoiding it completely, and then learning to go through a process or a step process to actually dealing with something to resolve it appropriately is challenging for people because they either don't do it or do it all at once instead of like walk this process, I think. So Jesus thankfully has given us kind of a roadmap on how to do this with every situation, really. Even though it's set in a religious context, it's applicable in every situation. And he says this about resolving conflict in Matthew 18. He says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you a Gentile and a tax collector. Okay, so here's this kind of long process Jesus maps out. Now again, it's in the context of like legal disputes in a religious context. He says in the church, he's kind of using it in a legal sense. Now again, it can go beyond that. I think the principles are still applicable to us. But it is within like when there's actually charges and offenses in a legal context and in a church body. But Jesus is saying there's this kind of 3-step process, 4-step process actually, to resolving conflict. Now, I think this is helpful for us because it shows that 1, you can't avoid conflict, but 2, you have to approach it with a process in mind. Because if you don't, it's going to end badly. So what's the encouragement here as you read this and hear about this? What's the encouragement from Jesus' path about resolving conflict that you can glean from this yourself, or that you feel like you've experienced some yourself in this?
And one of the things I'll add in there about peacemaking is there's another path, which is forgiveness. I think the first step is like forgiveness, if possible, right? Like, and I think it is possible in a lot of different scenarios. The second is, okay, well, we need to resolve this, right? Because it needs to be resolved. And I like and this is how we do it in C.A.R., is we encourage everyone to resolve their, conflicts directly in between each other first. Like have you had a conversation first? Then I think it's good to have other counsel. It was kind of what Jesus is saying, is bring others. In this case, he's talking in a witness sense, but I think that there's wisdom in saying, am I in a vacuum? And am I in a box? Have I worked myself up and I'm being unreasonable here? And that helps you understand, am I being reasonable about the claim? Or have I built this up to be a lot bigger than it is? And I think friends help you do that, and that's where it's establish it with 2 or more. And then, for us, we have, a chaplain. So they'll go to our chaplain, which allows essentially someone outside the situation from the lens of the word to listen to all parties and hopefully counsel to the answer, not judge the answer, but counsel the answer. And then the last is, the judge, which would be, essentially the ultimate authority in a company, or in the highest authority to be able to decide, kind of like a judge would in a court. And so we've established that just based off of that exact scripture, because this comes up all the time and we've had to leverage it numerous times, but we haven't had to get to the end. Which is great, because people are able to resolve conflict at some level or other, or they need a certain level of sounding board depending on the severity of the problem, right? And I think that's a huge testament to people, that Jesus is saying, I trust people to resolve these problems, is most of the steps here. And I trust those that I've entrusted to be wise enough to make decisions or heed good counsel.
That's great, Josh. Anyone else? How is this process worked out in your own experience, or how do you glean from it just the wisdom that Jesus is teaching about the process of resolving conflict?
What kind of just stood out to me this morning is that where he's saying, if someone sins against you, right? Which that right there, and kind of unpacking that, when you are feeling that conflict or feeling like you should approach somebody, did this person sin against me? Or am I just annoyed by something that they do? Like, was that a sin against me? Or does it just bother me that, they wear that shirt?
Yeah, because your offense could be a sin against them.
Right. Like, am I nitpicking? Am I nagging? Right. If you're looking at like in a relationship circumstance, right? And stereotypically it's the wife that nags, right? So am I nagging? Am I bringing up this conflict because it's a sin against me? Yeah. Or maybe do I just need to have a little bit more grace? Maybe they just do something a different way. It's not a sin against me if they load the dishwasher differently than me, right? Like, kind of having that wisdom of pausing and saying, okay, what is the actual thing that's going on right now, and addressing if it's a sin, or if I just need to show more grace because someone just does something differently than me.
Yeah, I think Jesus, like I said, he makes it a very clear kind of process, both the legal process, but like a stepwise process to like achieving some kind of resolution. And a lot of times we elevate things that are not to be elevated.
Yeah.
And even when there is sin, the Bible says love covers that. Now, we got to be careful here, because I think some people, because they want control of people, churches included, they try to use religion to gain control over people. So you got to be very careful about kind of making this such a neat and tidy experience. Reality is forgiveness takes a long time for people, I think, a lot of times. Though it's a command from God, we need to move towards it. It's not an option as a believer. It's not like, well, if you want to forgive. No. You have to forgive according to God. And it doesn't mean you have to forgive today, but you've got to work towards it, because Jesus says, otherwise I will not forgive you. Like, it's very clear. So we have to understand, like, forgiveness is a responsibility we have that we have to move towards. And if we can't resolve with somebody else, we need to enter this process with them. But a lot of times we just need to learn to let things go, given the magnitude of them.
Yes.
And we have to become very gifted at that, I feel like, to learn to not create all sorts of problems all the time with people. But there is a process to enter in when it's actually something that's hurtful. And maybe something that's small does become very hurtful. I don't know. But we got to be kind of, when do we enter this process? And if we're needing to, we need to be honest about that instead of avoiding it or being passive aggressive, right? So I don't know. There's a sense of that path that helps to give clarity, but we've got to know, hey, when is it elevated to a place I need to enter into that, or I need to forgive, right? So anyone else, what's just you take away from this path that Jesus is teaching?
I would say the other side of, like, sometimes with those, forgiveness on the other side of it can often lead to captivity and bondage.
Yeah.
Like, so some people, if there's an abusive relationship or things like that, they often feel trapped and unable to escape. And, oftentimes it's because they're rich in forgiveness.
Yeah.
And the enemy will often use that to manipulate and control someone or captivate someone. Yeah. And so I'd encourage you, if you're in that, to get yourself free of it, because that is definitely not, you're called to peace. It says in other scriptures for this stuff there's a process here, because eventually it's to get the end of it is separation, right? So it's not a forever thing. Yeah. And if you find yourself in that, I would just encourage you to reevaluate scripture on it's not one verse trumping all other verses. It's everything together. All the words of God are true, right? And so there is a process for this, and I would just encourage, forgiveness, but there's to an extent where you just need to separate and still forgive them, but by that meaning not hold something against them in your heart, but also at the same time separation, so that you don't find yourself in bondage.
Yeah, I think that there tends to be confusion when it comes to, like, these concepts of being a peacemaker versus a peacekeeper versus forgiveness, and then someone ending up reading all this in the Bible and thinking, okay, well, I'm going to forgive. I'm going to keep the peace. And then they end up being a doormat, and Jesus doesn't call us to be doormats, So I think being able to, when sin and when conflict does arise, like having that strength from the Lord to be able to say, okay, well, how do I resolve this in a manner that people aren't getting hurt, where people, there is a resolution, and in the end, God willing, we're all closer to God for it, rather than, okay, well, I'm just going to bring up the conflict or avoid it altogether, and then neither person in that situation is any closer to God, right?
Yeah.
There is a, kind of to that point there's a verse that I think people often misconstrue, but you got to look at the original text is, if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. And what it's actually saying is turn from them, kind of like repentance, like turning away from a thing with wisdom is actually the word. So it's actually not like be beat down and offer to be beat down some more. It's actually turn and now think wisely about your moves in a different direction. We will go through things in this time, but that's not the kingdom, and the victory's already won. And so you have to, you can't kind of like settle into that agreement about, the result of being holy is I've suffered a lot in my life and therefore I'm a more holy person. There's maybe a lack of wisdom in some of that, in that you were supposed to shift, you were supposed to move with wisdom, you were supposed to do something, you're supposed to follow the scripture and follow the process, and you didn't do it. And so that also, I would encourage people not to, sit in bondage that way, thinking that it's a holiness thing, right?
Yeah. I think there's what we've kind of, summarized here, I think, is that we have to be wise in how we, evaluate the importance of these conflicts. How important is a conflict? And I think if there is a conflict with somebody that's just a preferential thing, I think it's okay to admit that. I don't think we always have to just kind of like stuff that down or whatever. Like, it's okay to like just go talk to somebody, but we don't need to consider it like a sinful thing, right? It can just be like, hey, we have a disagreement here. Can we kind of work this out? It can be more casual, in that way. I think Jesus is talking more when the stakes are high, right? The stakes are very high. There's legal issues here. There's spiritual issues of sin here. There's a pathway to resolution. And he even says if it doesn't resolve, you cut someone out. And I think that's important to know that Jesus says that. Now, that's not what we want, but that can be a result. So there's a pushback in culture now that people just jump to that part. Very dangerous. That's not what Jesus is teaching. But there's also the other side that's more common in previous generations of, we're never going to do that. No, that's not what Jesus taught either. He didn't say, let's just do this at all costs, and then people get abused and people suffer and all this other stuff. It's like, no, use the path. Use the path to resolve conflict. And I think that's the challenge, that when you avoid resolving it, you can get these dangerous situations. And if you just jump to the end, you're not doing it the way Jesus asked. So there's a sense of like, hey, if I've got a preferential issue, maybe that's all it is. But let's talk about that, because I want to work together with you, right? But if it's actually a sin, and I can't let it go, even though I've been told to let it cover, I do need to honestly engage in that. So I don't hold someone captive, hold someone captive to my own unforgiveness or whatever. We've got to learn to then evaluate it and then enter in when it's time to enter in. Otherwise, it's passive aggressiveness, it's conflict avoidance, or it's boiling over in all drag out fight, right? So I think it takes a lot of patience. I think you all have given a lot of really good wisdom of, let's assess it for what it is. Be slow to respond to what it is. Take time. Ask your spouse. Ask your friends. Ask other Christian brothers and sisters about, hey, am I off here? What do you think about this? Should I enter in this? Should I talk about this? And if everyone says that sounds wise, prayerfully enter into that. If not, let love cover is what I would say, right? Because let the Lord resolve things. Maybe he wants to resolve things in a way that doesn't include you directly, right? Maybe God wants to use somebody else to teach that person something, not you all the time. And that's hard, because sometimes you just want control, right? I just want to control this situation, this person, or just get the control of my feelings. And that's just not what God maybe wants.
A couple of things I would just say, like little tidbits of wisdom I've learned over the years as the Lord has talked to me about this. One is, he is trying to teach you forgiveness. And I've learned to pray for those that hurt me. And I had a series of work conflicts over the years, and every single person I prayed for, I'm batting 1,000, is they all got promoted out. I prayed blessing on their family. I prayed blessing on their career. For those that would slander me and come against me and try to ruin my own career. And every single one of them got promoted out of my way. I don't have a single person. The Lord asked me the other day, who stands against you to speak against you? No one, because he's blessed them all out or moved them all out, right? Not on anything I've done, but by him. So like you said, so maybe the Lord wants to teach you something, and then he'll help resolve the situation. That's one, and I think the other thing he taught me was, it's not about being right. You're not trying to go through this process to get your way. You're going through this process to show love. Love is slow to speak, keeps no record of wrong. All the things we're talking about here is just all in that Corinthians verse around the nature of love. Your point is to be love in this situation, right? So that's your anchor. So your anchor is actually light, love being light in that situation. And so if you anchor there, then, it's not really about being right. It's not whether or not you get your way or you prove your point, because none of that matters in eternity. What matters is love. That's the tally of worth that Jesus talks about, right? So I think I would just anchor on what's important as you're engaging in those conversations. Try to be light. Don't worry about being right. And, making sure that you are loving and forgiving them and blessing them in the process.
Yeah, that's great, Josh. And I think, just some really good wisdom from everyone today. And I think just some simple takeaways would be, I think, one, when it is a preferential issue, it doesn't mean it's not significant. Okay, that's not what we're saying. I think it just shows the level of how you engage. It should be different, right? And I think we should make sure that, let's go and let's engage this situation, but let's make sure that we engage it in appropriate. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill, right? It's kind of what people say, right? So making sure there's a sense of that is the first part of just, hey, let's just work out, because we want to have a meeting of minds here and understand each other, respect each other, work together, live together, whatever it is, to make sure we can exist, right? But then if it's something that's actually sin kind of stuff that rises to a level that we have to engage, I know I can't forgive this, it's going on, I'm going on about this. You got to make the decision to enter Matthew 18 and to do it the right way and to go about it one step at a time. Go to them personally. Go with others that are like-minded and will be unbiased. Then go between whatever authority is, whether it's work or church or family. Go in that way and understand that it's not forgiveness at all costs or reconciliation at all costs is a better way of saying it, though forgiveness is absolutely commanded. So we'd say, you are commanded to forgive. You're not commanded to reconcile. If someone is not going to forgive you, or someone's going to be abusive, or someone is just controlling, you're not called to enter a relationship with that person long term. So there's a sense of an out even Jesus gives if they don't walk through that path with you as well. So resolving conflict is something that is spiritually helpful and commanded in many ways, but there's also even parts we can't achieve. That we need to let the Lord work himself. So hopefully this is helpful for our listeners today. Thank y'all for coming, and this is, I think, a very helpful and I think constructive conversation that supports kind of what we want to do here, not only in our company but in our spiritual life. So just want to finish by just encouraging everyone to go to our website. If you're, again, interested in our company, our business, our ministry, you'll find everything online across automotive.com. We encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions about these things. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to engage with you. Thanks again for making this a good episode, y'all, and I appreciate y'all. Until episode 5, signing off.